One of the best things about the DC animated universe is the way that the creative team managed to streamline decades of comic book continuity. They weren't interested in just reproducing their favourite comic book characters. If they thought that a specific element of a character hindered them, then they'd drop it. And a really good example of this from Justice League is the villain Eclipso. He began as a character defined by the darkness inside of a single man, a metaphor for the impulses we all carry. Decades later, he was reimagined as a god of vengeance with a black diamond that acted as both a prison and a weapon. And when Justice League brought him to the screen, that personal, introspective threat was transformed into a global external force. The darkness became something to confront, overcome, and contain. As such, I find myself thinking about what is gained and what is lost when a villain built on internal conflict is scaled up to a story about collaboration, courage, and the tangible fight against evil. But before I get to that, let's first go through his comic book history, because this will help illustrate why the animated version was so different. Eclipso made his first appearance in 1963's House of Secrets number 61. He was introduced as a standard supervillain, a Jekyll-and-Hyde-like figure tied to a human host, Bruce Gordon. Gordon was a solar scientist who went to a far-off jungle to observe a solar eclipse. While there, Gordon was attacked by a tribal sorcerer named Mofia, who cursed him with a black diamond. This triggered Gordon's transformation into Eclipso whenever an eclipse occurred. You'd think that wouldn't be too big of an issue, what with eclipses being quite rare, but you'd be wrong. Eventually his transformation could be triggered by light simply being obscured. Regardless of the contrivances, he was a metaphorically rich character. The shrouding of light brings about the darker personality that lives within. The light, his public-facing self, isn't gone, it's just hidden behind the moon, his darker side. Early stories focused on the duality of Gordon and Eclipso, with Eclipso wielding super strength, partial invulnerability, and destructive eye blasts. All the basics of your classic Silver Age villain powers, regardless of if it made sense or not. But he was a fairly isolated character, rarely interacting with superheroes, and that made him feel a little insignificant. Following Crisis on Infinite Earths in the mid-1980s, when DC's continuity was reset, Eclipso was one of the lesser characters that went through a pretty big change. During the Darkness Within crossover, Eclipso was reintroduced as a major threat impacting the world. He had been retconned to the god of vengeance whose soul had been trapped for centuries within a giant black diamond, the Heart of Darkness, while simultaneously existing without a body in a palace on the moon, as you do. He had been responsible for the biblical flood, but was too cruel and callous, and as such he was imprisoned in the diamond. The Heart of Darkness was discovered by an explorer, but it was so large and therefore valuable that it was impossible to sell. So it was cut into 1,000 identical shards and sold off in chunks. However, this gave Eclipso the power to possess anyone who touched a shard, so long as they felt rage at the time. While this was a limitation, it still made him far more dangerous and unpredictable. No longer confined to eclipses or to Gordon alone, his ultimate goal was to create a body for himself to allow him to leave his fortress and enact his vengeance. As part of the crossover, he took control of dozens of heroes, including Wonder Woman and Green Lantern, with them all acting as an extension of his will. Eventually, the remaining heroes and Gordon teamed up to destroy Eclipso using solar energy, but in true evil villain fashion, part of him survived. Clearly, DC were committed to making him a big deal because they gave him his own solo series, which was fairly common in the 90s. See also Deathstroke the Terminator and Lobo. The series picked up shortly after the end of The Darkness Within, and he terrorized the South American nation of Parador, leaving death and destruction in his wake. Through his manipulations, he seized control of the country and transformed it into his base of operations on Earth. He was ultimately contained when the Phantom Stranger and the Spectre reassembled the Heart of Darkness and imprisoned him once more, but of course that wouldn't be the end of him. His final defeat, at least as far as Justice League is concerned, came after he took control of the Spectre. When Earth's magical heroes teamed up to free him, the Spectre delivered justice on Eclipso, crushing the Heart of Darkness along with Eclipso's lunar base, spreading his ashes through the void of space. This was a fittingly cosmic end for a villain whose ambitions were never confined to Earth alone. So when the time came for the character to appear in Justice League, there was quite a lot of material to work with. The DC Animated Universe creative team took the core element of the character, namely an evil spirit that possesses people through contact with a black diamond, and pretty much disregarded everything else. The Justice League episode Eclipsed never names its villain Eclipso, yet the series makes clear through visual cues, narrative echoes, and ironic references that this is Eclipso. The Black Diamond, the possession of others, and the unending desire for vengeance remains intact, but the show cuts out all of the religious references and even pokes a little fun at his comic book counterpart's appearance. Instead of Bruce Gordon as a human host, the first episode gives us two figures, Burns, an unsuspecting soldier, and General McCormick, a military authority figure who becomes the face of the threat before it possesses the Justice League in the second part of the story. The gem functions like the Heart of Darkness, possessing those who come into contact with it, but no rage is required, so the possession is depersonalized. The Black Diamond contains the souls of the Ophidians, ancient snake-like warriors rather than a single demonic entity. The Ophidians had been a competitor to humanity long before history began, and when their numbers started to dwindle, they performed a dark ritual that bound their souls to a black diamond. Anyone that touches the diamond falls under their control, and so those early tribesmen built a temple to hide it away. Cut to the present day and a group of American soldiers stumble upon the diamond, and yeah, you can guess the rest. By making the entity within the diamond the Ophidians, the personal duality that defined Eclipso in the early comics, where the villain was the literal shadow of Bruce Gordon, is gone. But then, that was mostly true of the post-crisis comics too. So it's not necessarily a worse idea, it's just different. Rather than wanting to build a body, the Ophidians plan to use an anti-fusion device to extinguish the sun and kill off humanity. Pretty dark, pun intended. But it's offset by the fact that this is a Flash-centric story. This allows for some playful self-referential moments. For instance, when the Ophidians, while in control of General McCormick, ask a soldier how to get the Justice League's attention. He responds by saying that dressing up like a fool and causing problems usually does the trick. Taking him seriously, McCormick dresses in a garish, over-the-top costume, much like Eclipso's comic book design, and talks about destroying the world. The moment is genuinely very funny because, while those in the know recognise the visual callback, the show treats it as ridiculous. Similarly, the metaphor of darkness emerging when the light is obscured is literalised through the Ophidian scheme. It's a global peril rather than an internal struggle, which is in keeping for the Justice League. At the same time, the series retains echoes of the classic metaphor. Take how Mofir's ruby and the light it generates is the only counter to the possession other than lopping their heads off. The recurring idea of light banishing darkness remains intact, but the scale is much bigger. Additionally, the Ophidians are never called Eclipso. They become an amalgam of ancient myth, modern militarism, and visual parody, rather than the embodiment of vengeance. I know I'm going back to the visual callback of McCormick in the Eclipso costume, but what I really like about it is how it acknowledges the history of the character while simultaneously separating him from the psychological and moral weight of the comics. The darkness within exists, but it's diluted, externalized, and made accessible for dramatic confrontation rather than internal reflection. Unlike in the comics, where Eclipso's threat is cyclical and deeply tied to human sins, the animated story treats darkness as a removable hazard, something the Flash can outrun and neutralize. At the same time, another comic book callback I particularly enjoyed was the way the diamond was shattered into 1,000 pieces when Hawkgirl hits it with her mace, and funnily enough that was usually the solution to most problems in early Justice League stories, but the damage causes the diamond shards to become embedded in every Justice League member, barring the Flash. This is a nice callback to the Darkness Within crossover, and the threat of the possessed League was palpable as they stalked the Flash through the Watchtower. But when the Flash lures them into the generator room and exposes them to an incredibly bright source of light, the souls of the Ophidians are forced back into the diamonds and they are never seen again. In summary, the Justice League adaptation preserves some of the symbolic DNA of Eclipso, the Black Diamond, the idea of possession, and evil spirits being driven by vengeance, but it was massively streamlined. The darkness within is externalized into an ancient curse. The moral conflict between the host and the villain is pretty much removed, and humor is injected to keep the story from being too bleak. Where the comics provoke reflection on latent human cruelty and the faults of man, the animated version delivers a thrilling, globally scaled adventure in which darkness is dangerous, but ultimately manageable, containable, and at times a little silly. In the end, Justice League's take on Eclipso is just a different version. What was once an intimate metaphor about suppressed rage and wickedness becomes an ancient infection that can be shattered, scattered, and ultimately swept away. And perhaps that makes perfect sense for Justice League. They are a team built to face invasions, cataclysms, and new gods, so they need their threats to be scaled up. While I wouldn't blame anyone for saying that the animated Eclipso feels diminished when compared to his comic book counterpart, I think that ultimately the show makes a different argument about human nature. This version of Eclipso says that darkness is something that can be confronted through speed, courage, or collaboration. The sun returns because the League worked together to restore it, and that's a fundamentally different philosophy. The comics explore the shadow inside of us. The cartoon shows that when darkness rises, the light will return if we all stand together. Okay, that's it for this essay. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really liked the video and feel like tossing a buck or two my way, please consider using the thanks button, because every little helps. And if you have really enjoyed my work, you might want to pick up a copy of my book, Rogues Gallery. It features 22 essays on villains from Batman the Animated Series. There's a beautiful cover by Batman the Animated Series background artist John Calmette, a foreword by director Dan Reber, and a moving segment from the late Kevin Conroy sharing his thoughts on life, love, and loss. Plus, an exclusive essay on the Condiment King that will never be made into a video. Rogues Gallery is available worldwide on Amazon, both digitally and in softcover. Finally, channel memberships are just $1.99 a month and give you early access to my essays, custom emojis, and your name featured on my members end screen, which has been rolling for a little while now. Huge thanks to everyone who's already part of this. You've helped to make these videos possible. If you want to see your name up here too, join the channel now. And while I have your attention, please consider checking out my other channel, Serum Lake Comics, where I talk about mostly DC comic books. Next time. When I return on Monday, I'll be going back to the results of my Batman the Brave and the Bold poll to talk about the character that came in second place. Yes, we're going to be talking about Jaime Reyes, the Blue Beetle. And next Friday, I'll continue my look at the heroes of Beware the Batman by talking about a man who had a transformation forced upon him, but went on to make the best of a bad situation. We'll be talking about Man-Bat. Hope to see you then.